We are casting this starry-themed lidded resin jar using epoxy resin and some pigment powders, ink plus caviar beads to get the look just right. To create the twilight background, I'm using some of this gorgeous black mica pigment, this fantastic peacock bluish chameleon pigment, and this shimmery purple orange. I'm going to use all of them to paint a gradient on this central cylindrical surface. Before painting in the pigments, the mold needs to be prepared. So, I'm going to wrap the outer surface of the mold with some cling film because silicone absolutely loves attracting all kinds of dust and pigment powder. While I'm brushing the pigments onto the mold, I want the front surface to stay absolutely clear. For the sunset look, the orange pigment will form the base of the gradient. I'll brush it in slightly. If you can see, the silicone is just pulling all the powders towards it. This is fascinating. This gradient starts with orange and ends with black at the top. I really enjoy painting with pigment powders. Even single colors have such an impact. I'm bridging this black to orange transition with this bluish pigment to mimic the colors you see around sunset. Let's brush the powder into the mold as thoroughly as possible. Once we pour the resin, if it isn't brushed in well, the epoxy will carry the pigment away and leave bald spots. This sort of gradation would also be very difficult to get through a simple pour using a resin and pigment mix, which is why I'm going for this background play. To be ultra sure everything is blended properly, I'm just going to use my fingers. A different finger for each shade so that they don't become one muddy color. Let's tap the excess pigment away. Time to fine-tune the edges with a little cleanup. And now our background is ready. Before I unfurl the mold back for casting, I wrap the pigmented portion with baking paper. This material is so versatile and has recently become my go-to material for a lot of hacks while working with resin. In this case, it protects the painted surface without sticking to it. I'm doing this because when I'm snapping the mold back into its original form for the pour, I don't want the outer surface to touch the inner surface. That would lead to a transfer of pigments. I want the outer surface to stay really clear, so the stars on the mold look like they're floating above the background. You can see my sunset backdrop remains protected and the foreground is clear. Let's clean up this space a little before moving on to preparing the resin and the pour. I'm using a low viscosity 2:1 resin here. Usually I use coating resin, but with all these star details, I'm worried about bubbles getting trapped in the relief. This thinner resin should help avoid that. So I'll just measure, mix and let it degas. Now that the epoxy is suitably prepped, let's put away a little portion aside. I'm adding purple alcohol ink to create an even mix for the pour. This will give the whole piece character. Because of the alcohol ink, the mix will stay translucent, almost looking like purple glass. I am curious to see if the image I have in mind will actually materialize after the pour, especially with the gradient background. I covered the mold while I was mixing the resin because my windows are open for ventilation and there is a lot of dust flying around. Let's pour. I'm going slowly and patiently because I really do not want any bubbles trapped in the corners of the stars. If I'm patient at this point, I'll reap the reward later. There have been many times I have dumped the resin in and regretted not going slower. There is a little space left, so I will quickly prepare a little more of the purple mix from the resin kept aside earlier and fill this up. Now this is almost filled to the brim. For the lid, I'm going to try something a little different. The resin has been sitting for a while, so I'm just going to drop the alcohol ink directly into the jar and see how it moves. I am tempted to create a bloom at this point in this lid, but I think it'll have to wait for another day. This looks a bit too clumpy, so I'll just swirl it around a little and help it assimilate. In hindsight, I should probably have mixed the whole thing with purple at once. but what's done is done. Who knows, I might learn something new when all this is over, and this might actually make the look more interesting. I do not want it to be too interesting and take attention away from the jar though. Now we'll let this cure over the next couple of days. My resin has cured, and as expected, the level has fallen very slightly. Look at this, even with all the swirling, the alcohol ink has created a very interesting bloom. Fascinating. I need to fill up the remaining space. It's a very small amount, so I'll just use 1:1 by volume coating resin. I'll mix it slowly, making sure it's as bubble free as possible, and let it degas before pouring. Bubbles are not an issue in such a shallow mix because the air escapes very easily because of the thin layer. This base mix will be a little darker. For the jar is just finishing the bottom. But for the lid, this darker mix is what will make it look less transparent and help it reflect light and take care of the unexpected blooming ink action in the lid. I have these silver caviar beads which I have used many times over to create stars in my projects. I will use them for the same purpose this time, though not so much in the foreground. This is a background detail. Just a little whimsy for the jar. I know it will not be visible, but for the lid, maybe it will create a little visual interest. This really looks like a starry sky from this side. Now, we wait for it to cure for another day. I had expected the caviar beads to sink, but I think the surface tension kept them afloat, which is probably the reason for that bizarre bloom as well. The beads also seem to have moved towards the center, and it happened even more aggressively here in the jar. However, thankfully, because it's the base, it isn't really going to affect the look of the jar. I have definitely learned that I cannot just sprinkle caviar beads. They move just like sinker pigments in a bloom. Next time, I need to make sure they actually sink into the resin so that they stay in place and they are not carried away by the surface tension action. Look at that. It is so beautiful. The casting is absolutely perfect. It's so clear and there are no stray pigments where they shouldn't be. Patience with the mixing and pouring really did pay off. Let's get the lid out too. I'm really loving the finish on this. It's absolutely stunning. Simple but stunning. The mold is high quality, which you can tell by the finish of the casting. I am glad I made the base a little darker too. The lid fits perfectly and the background effect is working nicely with the purple color. It's very subtle and the gradient looks really pretty. There's a little flashing here on the edge, so let's just pull it off. The shadows cast by the little stars on the background are looking awesome. The depth is looking fabulous. The sunset against the light is looking fantastic and shimmery. The translucency is exactly what I planned. I'm glad this worked out. Now, to finish this piece, I'm going to color these little stars on the surface with some silver acrylic paint. Hope this was a fun watch. Happy crafting and have a wonderful day.